Hi guys, it's Megan. I'm back in my library today. I'm a high school librarian, and today we are going to do what is going to now be my annual awards ceremony. I think I'll do this every New Year's Eve just because it'd be cool. Trust me, I don't normally wear this gaudy jewelry. It's just for New Year's Eve. So, without further ado, let's get into the awards. So the first award I want to give out is obviously the best book that I read this year. I'm also going to do the best new book I read because this one is a reread technically. But the best book I actually read this year is The Witching Hour by Anne Rice. I talked about it a lot earlier on in the year, like mid-year when I first started my channel. So I'm not going to tell you too much about each of these books here, but it does follow a family of witches and it spans many generations, 13 to be exact. I love Anne Rice's writing style. It's amazing. This is just one of the best books I've ever read. And even though I also reread some of the Dresden Files books this year and some of the Game of Thrones books this year, it was really hard to compare all of them, but Anne Rice is my favorite author, so best book that I read this year for sure. The best new book that I read this year, because I feel like I can't just give out awards just for books that I have reread, is The Priory of the Orange Tree, and I just finished reading this one in December. So it did take me the whole year to find my best book of the year. Honestly, I don't know what I would have picked for a new book. Maybe The Diviners, but I don't know. This one is by Samantha Shannon, and it is a standalone fantasy novel, which is why I loved it, because it was fast-paced. It was like Game of Thrones, but in one book. Yes, it's long. It's 800 pages. But that's it. That's all you have to commit to. You don't have to commit to 5 1,000-page books. You just read 800 pages and you're done. And because of that, it is so fast-paced. I say that over and over because that's the main feature of this book that I absolutely loved. I didn't care too much about the characters, like they were just sort of there, but the plot was really good. The intrigue, it definitely kept me interested for sure. So I would highly recommend this to anybody that likes fantasy. All right, let's go ahead and do what am I talking about? The worst book I read. I wish it was the last book I read. That doesn't make any sense either. What am I even talking about? Let's go ahead and do the worst book that I read this year. Sad but true. It kind of matches my outfit though, I realize now. That's kind of cool. So Court of Frost and Starlight by Sarah J. Maas. It was not good. This book, of course, is the sort of like companion 4th novel in the Court of Thorns and Roses series. And I said that correctly this time for like the first time ever. The first 3 were, I liked the first one pretty well. I liked the second one pretty well. The third one I did not like. And then this one's like the little novella that follows it to kind of bridge between that series and the new series that's coming out here in just a couple months. I don't think I'll be reading the new series because I don't care about, I know that it's going to follow Nesta and Cassian or whatever. Don't care about Nesta, so don't think I'll read it. But this book was just boring. It was basically about Christmas. I remember there being some sort of stupid fairy snowball fight. It's like, oh yeah, the High Lord of the Night Court is going to be in a snowball fight. Like, it was so stupid. She was just shopping for Christmas presents, and I don't know, it was pointless. And I'm sad that I actually bought this and wasted money, although it is probably the prettiest book that I bought this year. So at least there's that. All right, next is the vampire book that I read that had the least amount of vampires in it. That is The Beautiful by Renee Ahdieh, however you say it. I just cannot help but mention this book because of how bad it was. I only read about half and then I DNF'd it. It is a young adult novel that is supposedly about vampires, which I don't know, maybe that's even kind of a spoiler, but it's not good. It's set in New Orleans in the 1800s, and so I thought it was going to be kind of like a young adult version of like Interview with a Vampire or Anne Rice vampires. It's not, and there were like no vampires yet and no intrigue, and I didn't care about anything that was happening. It was so slow paced. I didn't care about the characters, so I was just shocked at the lack of vampires though. This novel was supposed to bring back vampires, and yet it did not. We're going to go ahead and give an award to the only romance novel that I read this year because I never read romance novels. So the fact that I read one is pretty exciting. This is the only one that I read, so it gets the award for the only romance novel I read. This is Field Notes on Love by Jennifer E. Smith. It was an award-winning novel, so I just thought I would try it out. It wasn't bad. It was, less than 300 pages. Yeah, so easy to read, fast to read, or should I say fewer than 300 pages. There we go. The English teacher in me coming out. So it was basically about a guy and a girl who go on a train ride across the continent together, and they've never even met each other before. And of course they fall in love. And it was cute. Each one of them, I would say it's almost more of a realistic fiction because each of the characters had like their own issues that they were dealing with. It was more about that rather than the romance part of it. So maybe that's why I liked it a little bit, because it wasn't very much romance. But the only romance novel I read, so it gets an award. All right, next is the biggest surprise of the year. I would have to say that goes to The Diviners by Libba Bray. I was surprised at the fact that, one, that I enjoyed this book because it's a young adult novel that was listed in the horror section of our library. We put the genres on the side here, but it was not really, I would say it's more like fantasy and like historical fiction as well, because it wasn't really that scary, but it was a very interesting concept for sure. About these people that all have these different powers that are kind of like coming together to defeat this ancient evil that has awakened but it's set in the 1920s in New York City. So it's like the roaring 20s, and I never usually read historical fiction. Don't care about New York in the 1920s, but I really enjoyed this, and the writing is the thing that surprised me the most. No one told me how well written it was. Like, I just heard a lot about it, but it is surprisingly very, very well written. I've heard the audiobook is also good for this. I've never read it, but there is a kind of a cast of characters that it switches back and forth their points of view between, so that's interesting. And there are 3 sequels, so it's a quartet, I guess you would say, and I do plan on finishing the series eventually. I took a little break so I didn't get burned out, but I am intrigued to continue on. Sorry, I get so out of breath. Oh my gosh, just talking for a couple minutes at a time. My lungs have no capacity left. The baby is taking up all the room. So, oh, by the way, in case you want to know, the baby is due in like 6 weeks. Yeah, 6 weeks. So we're almost there. All right. Anyway, so the next book I want to give an award to is the best nonfiction novel that I read this year. That's not saying much. I only read 1.5 nonfiction novels, but this one is so good that it definitely deserves a nod. If I had read more nonfiction books, I still believe that this would have been my favorite. So Outliers, The Story of Success by Malcolm Gladwell. This book is about how and why people are successful, and it's not what you think. It has nothing to do with how talented they are, or how hard they work at something, or how much they practice. It could be anything from, being a sports star to like a tycoon of technology like Bill Gates or someone. And he argues that it's actually a lot of factors beyond people's control, such as the year they were born, the time of year they were born, just the circumstances that they have in place, basically. And he even talks about why we've never heard of the basically the world's smartest man. He theoretically has the highest IQ, but he did not have the circumstances surrounding him to actually make him successful, basically, depending on what your definition of success is. But anyway, super interesting. I remember literally every chapter I'd finish, I would call my parents and tell them and be like, oh my gosh, guys, you won't believe this part. Or I would tell my husband. So I highly recommend this. It's just super fascinating for literally anyone to read. Next is the funniest book I read this year, and that award goes to Hold Me Closer, Necromancer. The title even kind of gives that away. It was funny, it was cute, it says scary. It wasn't really scary. It was different. It really stood out. It wasn't like laugh out loud funny, but there were just some plot twists and things that happened that you're like, oh my gosh, what? And I remember I loved the ending and could not wait to read the sequel. And I was a little let down by the sequel because this one sets up with like such a good ending that it could have had just an epic sequel, but it did not. Anyway, it's still worth a read. It is a young adult novel, but I mean, just go by the title. I mean, seriously, right? And my last 2 awards, I have the series that I started that I will probably never finish. So this award goes to Daughter of Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor. I really enjoyed this first one. It was a young adult categorized in my library as horror novel, but I'm going to recategorize it, I believe, as fantasy. It's also kind of a romance. I would say it's definitely more fantasy romance than anything else. Kind of reminded me of like the Underworld movies for some reason, like the same kind of vibe as those. I don't know. But it definitely had some romance and stuff in it, the second half especially. The setup was really cool. The plot was really unique. It wasn't your typical young adult coming of age story. It really did not have anything to do with that. So I thought that was pretty cool. But when I tried reading the sequel, I could not get into it. I tried reading the sequel physically. I got about 150 pages in. Then I switched over to the audiobook much later and tried like maybe 50 pages of it. Could not get into that either. And then I started reading online, and pretty much all the reviews were saying, you know, the second and third ones are just not as good as this one. And while I like her writing style a lot, I just don't see myself continuing on with this book. But I know she wrote Strange the Dreamer as well. I think that's a duology. I will definitely try that one because I like her writing for sure, but I just don't think I will ever finish this series. I lied, there's actually 2 more awards. My next award goes to the book that I said I would read the most times. I believe I mentioned that I would read this book and never did. And that is The Seven Deadly Shadows by these 2 authors, Courtney Alameda and Valen E. Maitani. Can't pronounce these things. But this one I talk about a lot. I feel like I've mentioned it on several TBRs. I even had that was my bookmark that I had stuck in there. And it's sort of based on like Japanese like mythology kind of from the sounds of it. And it just sounded so good. I got it in a book box that is just delivered to me monthly at the school. So I didn't necessarily pick it out. But when I read it, I was like, oh, this is perfect. And I've mentioned it on so many TBRs. It's little and it's young adult, so it's not going to take that long to read. It's 350-ish pages. So I've got to get around to it. No one has ever talked about it on BookTube. I've not heard a single BookTuber ever mention it or even show it on their channel. So I don't know if that's a bad sign, but maybe I can find something that other people will like. I just have to actually make time to read it. And my last award, I shouldn't have saved this to last because it's actually kind of a bad one, but I would like to talk about my biggest disappointment of the year. And it's not a book, it's an author. If you've watched any of my videos, you guys may already know this, but Brandon Sanderson, he is my biggest disappointment of the year. I expected just great things. Maybe that's the problem. He was so hyped up for me that my expectations were through the roof. So I tried reading both the Mistborn trilogy series. I started with The Final Empire. I listened to it on audiobook. Maybe that was the problem. I don't know. But I just could not get into it. I thought the magic system was just really weird. Like the fact that you could eat metals and each of them gives you a different like power kind of or ability. But that was weird. I didn't like the characters very well. I didn't like the writing style. I thought it was just so plain and so boring. Like I have students that have written better than that, I feel like. So then I gave up and I tried the Stormlight Archive series instead. I started with The Way of Kings and I made it 600 or 700 pages in out of 1,000 and like nothing was happening. It was so boring. I mean, I could not believe how boring it was. And this is coming from somebody who likes slow, character-driven books, like Anne Rice books. There are some that have really not that many things happening. It's just, characters talking, but the characters are so amazing that you just don't care that there's no plot. But in this book, it was, oh my gosh, I just couldn't make myself power through it. I just didn't care about anything. And I thought the writing was not good either. And it was very repetitive and just some parts were just kind of silly, honestly. I don't understand what people see in Brandon Sanderson. And quite frankly, every time I hear somebody talk about Brandon Sanderson on YouTube, I start to wonder if I'm going to like the same types of books that that person likes. I have a couple YouTubers I follow who agree that Brandon Sanderson is not for them and is not the best writer. And so usually I'm more inclined to trust those booktubers now than other ones because I know that they'll at least probably like the same kinds of books that I do if that's the case. So we're ending on a bad note, but 2020 was bad, so whatever. Except for the baby, there's that. So if you all can see him, I don't know. There he is. All right, so 2021, hopefully I will find a lot more books that I really enjoy, and I will continue doing this awards show every year. So have a good New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.